Turning to our speaker tonight, I'm particularly pleased to welcome Paul Tucker, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England from 2009 to 2013. Paul's full bio is detailed in the programs that you have at your seats, but allow me to just note two qualities that strike me about his background. First, Paul is a scholar of unusual and impressive interdisciplinary scope. In addition to his current position as chair of the Systemic Risk Council, he is a senior fellow at the Harvard Business School and at the Harvard Center for European Studies, and before that at the Harvard Kennedy School. So he is someone whose affiliations reflect his multidisciplinary background, which I think is particularly valuable in this subject matter. Second, Paul is a monetary and financial policy practitioner of unusual experience. Most recently and most publicly, he served from 2009 to 2013 as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, the UK Central Bank. That was obviously a particularly challenging time and spanning the most intense periods of the financial crises in the US and the UK, as well as the financial crisis in the Euro area. And in this environment of national and international financial crises, Sir Paul, he was granted a knighthood for his services to central banking in 2014, also played a key international role. After the G20 established the Financial Stability Board in April 2009, he served as a member of the steering committee of the FSB and chaired the FSB's Committee on the Resolution of Cross-Border Banks. Finally, his service as Deputy Governor at the Bank of England followed 20 years of service in nearly every part of the Bank of England. So we're very lucky to have as our speaker today someone who is both, again, an experienced practitioner and an unusually interdisciplinary scholar. Let me now turn over the floor to Paul Tucker, who will speak for 20 or 30 minutes. Our own Professor Wilmarth will then sit with Paul and begin some Q&A for a similar amount of time, followed by Q&A from the audience. Following the end of the formal program, we've arranged for the University Bookstore to have some copies for sale of Paul's just published book, Unelected Power, The Quest for Legitimacy in Central Banking and the Regulatory State, and Paul has generously agreed to sign copies of his book. With that, please join me in welcoming Paul Tucker.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you, Art, for inviting me to be here. Let me just grab the water in case I need it. If you write a book, you want to talk about it. And you want to talk about it for two reasons. You want to talk about it so people buy it, and you also want to talk about it so that people will tune into what it's about and reach their own views on what it's about. And of those two reasons, because I'm 60 rather than 40, I care more about the second than I do about the first. I was a central banker for 33 years. During that time, central banks became more and more powerful. Over the same period, most of our societies, certainly in Europe and the United States, gave more and more powers to unelected technocrats in independent regulatory agencies. When I was born in 1958, people my parents and grandparents elected seemed to be in charge. And here I am in middle age, and sometimes it can seem that my tribe is in charge, and I'm uncomfortable with that. And so my book is an attempt to bring political economy, economics, into line with political theory and, if you like, although I'm not a lawyer, constitutionalist principles. I think this matters because of a basic feature of representative democracy. The representative democracy is brilliant because it separates, amongst the many things it does, it separates how we feel about the system of government from how we feel about the government of the day. So that when inevitably, I will assert inevitably, parts of government fail, perform poorly, let the people down, sometimes with very high social costs, as for example, with the financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9, it matters a lot that people can't vote out the people that were head of the agencies that were meant to ensure that the system was safe and sound. And the more fields are insulated from day-to-day politics, the more people are going to be both disappointed by performance, because that's inevitable, I assert, and yet feel that they can't remedy it via the ballot box. And so the aim of my book is to try and articulate what I call principles of delegation to independent agencies. I'm going to define what I mean by independent agencies that could be a kind of social norm or a political norm in our societies on either side of the Atlantic. One not health warning, but conditioning assumption up front is I am talking about delegation within healthy democracies. I am not talking about delegation to technocrats in one-party states. I am not talking about delegation to technocrats in countries that are transitioning from authoritarian government to democratic constitutionalist government. I'm assuming that constitutional democracy is in some kind of steady state and is healthy, and we could debate that assumption, but it's not a bad approximation of the last 25 years, and I want to kind of find out where it takes us. This, of course, given how I'd spent my adult life, was prompted by the powers that central banks accrued. It's worth saying that compared with the great crisis in the 1920s and the 1930s, the impact on central banks' powers has been very different this time round. In the late 20s and the 30s, they basically ended up losing all of their powers, in some cases through changes of the law. In some cases there weren't changes in the law, but there was a de facto transfer of powers from the central bank building to the building of the Treasury or Prime Minister or President. Whereas this time, more or less every central bank has gained new powers. In particular, they've gained more regulatory powers. In some cases, like the United States, the Federal Reserve was already a regulator. It now has more regulatory powers. In my own country, United Kingdom, the Bank of England had historically been a regulator. Then it wasn't for a while, but after the crisis, it is again. Bank of England has more powers than it has had for 100 years. In the other big part of the advanced economy world, European Central Bank didn't have any regulatory powers before the crisis, and now it is the bank supervisor for all the big banks in the euro area. And what matters about this is, and I won't come to this until towards the end of my remarks, if at all, is it means that the standard arguments that economists use for justifying an independent monetary authority can't carry across. You can't just substitute regulation for monetary policy and have the argument run through in a completely smooth, uninterrupted way. You have to sit back and think, well, is there a common argument? I'm going to suggest there is. And then secondly, is it okay to combine, even if you can make a case for an independent regulator and a case for an independent monetary authority, there's a separate question of, is it okay to put that in the same building, under the same small number of unelected human beings? And I want to suggest that the reason that there is a certain amount of controversy around the powers of the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, to a lesser extent perhaps the Bank of England, and around some regulators, independent regulators as well, is not just because their performance has been uneven, and not just because they're very powerful, but because somehow there's a gap in the principles of constitutionalism. So that the world that was designed for us by John Locke from my country, James Madison from the United States, Baron Montesquieu from France, it is a world where there are only three moving parts: executive government, legislature, and independent judiciary. And yet that is not the world, it appears not to be the world we live in, a world of the Federal Reserve and the SEC and the Environmental Protection Agency. Somehow you think, well, how do you slot, we've got a fourth branch. Milton Friedman in 1961 or 62 testified to the US Congress that there was a risk that the Federal Reserve was a fourth branch of government, and that was a very bad thing. I think he got himself into a muddle, but that's not the point. The point is that the people sitting on the dais, it's kind of rather extraordinary, by the way, as an aside, the way that here you have to testify up to the elected people. In my country, they are definitely more powerful than you because they were elected, but they're on the same, they're not like the king or something like that, but we don't. Anyway, so there's a gap, there seems to be a gap in how we think about the structure of government, and that we can't go back to those founding texts or those founding thinkers and find the answer. And this matters because although we have constitutional values, actual constitutions set up incentives for legislators, and sometimes the incentives are at odds with the values, and I think that's particularly true here. So something I will return to a few times is the system here, by design, makes it hard for Congress to legislate. It also seems to have given them incentives to delegate power to regulatory agencies, and that appears not to square with the idea or value that high policy should be decided by people who we elect. Now, how do actual constitutions cope with the administrative state, with this panoply of regulatory agencies? Well, it varies enormously across countries, and I'm going to skip quickly over Germany, France, and the UK, and then say rather more about the United States. In Germany, partly because its constitution is relatively new for an advanced economy, written after the Second World War, the administrative state is explicitly catered for. It's almost unique amongst the main advanced economy democracies. It is explicitly catered for, and its position in the scheme of things is absolutely clear. It shall be under ministerial control. And under the German constitution, there is no room whatsoever for independent agencies. I'm abstracting a little bit from EU law, but let me just... the extraordinary thing about this is if that legal principle, which is a formal legal norm, is not matched in reality. There are definitely de facto independent agencies in German government, and I have worked with them, which is why I'm convinced I saw no evidence at times that they were having to refer back to a minister or a minister's civil servants to get a sense of direction. In the United Kingdom, of course, and one can caricature the lack of constitutionalism in Britain. We do actually have some written bits as well, as we don't have one written document, but it is absolutely the case that over domestic law, Parliament has a great deal of flexibility, and we moved very quickly from a world in which there were no independent agencies to a world in which there are lots of independent agencies. There are probably more formally independent agencies in the United Kingdom than there are in the United States, even though the United States started creating them in the 1880s and the United Kingdom started creating them in the 1990s. So that's the kind of thing that Britain's Westminster system can do. France has a written constitution, and it put, like Germany, but less explicitly, it puts administration under the Prime Minister. But the Constitutional Court, which is a very interesting body in all sorts of respects, provided that the Assembly can delegate regulation, lawmaking powers to independent agencies. And the Conseil d'Etat laid down that these independent agencies shall be completely independent from the elected executive. Whereas in the United Kingdom, ministers will often have override powers. In France, they do not have override powers. But the United States is in many respects the most interesting and complicated example. The Constitution doesn't explicitly cater for the administrative state at all. The court has allowed delegation to occur. Crudely speaking, your lawyers, I'm not, under a principle or under a doctrine that any delegation shall be framed by an intelligible principle. Those words are tremendously important. And I had a fantastic debate with an unnamed famous constitutional scholar about whether the principle of the intelligible principle is satisfied, which I will try to remember to say something about. Congress has also, the court has also made clear that Congress can stipulate case by case when it's delegating that the job holders can be protected from the president sacking them because she or he was fed up after breakfast, which is the for cause protection that goes back to Humphrey's executor, I think. Is that right? And the other thing that's interesting is the doctrine has changed slightly over the years, is that agencies are kind of formally regarded as the part of the executive branch because only Congress can legislate. And so the doctrine is that agencies of all kinds are merely filling in the details. So far we've got three words, intelligible principle and details, which have slipped their moorings because as we will see. So here's a bunch of US agencies which actually have different degrees of insulation from politics. But look at the objectives. So the Communications Commission, the objective is the public convenience, interest, or necessity, and so as to provide a fair, efficient, and equitable distribution of radio services. They've got other functions as well, but if you five were to form that commission, I think you're going to be doing a little bit more than filling in the details, like everything. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to ensure that utility-type charges are just and reasonable. That's even vaguer. The EPA to set a policy for air pollutants requisite to protect the public health. So they have to decide what the application and meaning of requisite to protect public and health are, with an adequate margin of safety, well, that's precise, and with a secondary requirement to deliver policies requisite to protect the public welfare. The SEC has to deliver a combination of investor protection, fair and orderly, efficient markets, and capital formation. And the Federal Reserve, in its regulatory functions, has to deliver safety and soundness of banking groups. And the idea that all that's going on is filling in the detail is ridiculous. The idea that the court has held implicitly or explicitly that there is an intelligible principle here must be right because they allowed the delegations to stand. But this is intelligible principle as a term of art. It's not the words in the English language, intelligible principle, that you might talk to your mum and dad and sisters and brothers about, because it is neither intelligible and it's certainly not principled. And I think the extent to which people don't want to face up to that is very interesting. So at this point, part of the solution, I think, and part of the problem lies in the need to distinguish between different degrees of insulation from politics. And so at this point, I need to offer a definition. By an independent agency, I mean an agency that is insulated from the day-to-day politics of both elected branches of government. So that is not how the term or the expression independent agency is used in US public law, because it's an expression that merely means insulated from the president, because the president can't sack you. So I mean insulated from Congress, insulated day-to-day from Congress as well. And I think there are three attributes of independence The agency has control over its delegated policy instruments, that the Secretary of State or the Cabinet Minister or the President can't send them a direction saying, use your instrument now to do this. Secondly, that the policymakers have job security, that they don't get out of bed wondering whether the President's gone off them, or in my country, the Prime Minister's gone off them. And thirdly, and this is rarely remarked upon, it's in a few papers in public law scholarship in the States, but its significance isn't discussed enough, is budgetary autonomy. And by that I mean that you don't have to go back to Congress and get your money each year. I don't necessarily mean that you never have to go back to your Congress. As an aside, the Bank of England has to go and get its budget approved by the Treasury and Parliament every 5 years. But the key thing about going back every year is that these things don't take a day to decide. If you have to go back every year, you are always in the shadow. You're always either in a negotiation or in the shadow of a negotiation that's about to begin. And since the budget appropriations can come with prescriptions and prescriptions, in a sense there is an annual legislative process deciding what the agency is for. Now, looked at that way, the SEC, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, the Federal Trading Commission, the Communications Commission would not be independent agencies on my definition because of having to go back to Congress each year. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is an independent agency on that definition, but in terms of where I'm going, it would not satisfy my principles for delegation. I think it is, I am not a partisan person either in my domestic politics in the UK or anywhere else. So I'm not making a point here about the worthiness of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau's mandate and purpose. I'm merely saying that it has too much insulation from day-to-day politics for reasons that I'll go on to explain. The Federal Reserve and the FDIC are independent agencies, and there's a whole slew of independent agencies in the UK. So why might a mature political democracy want to delegate to agencies insulated from day-to-day politics? Well, the standard argument in the New Deal period, articulated by one of the high priests of the New Deal, James Landis, who was one of the architects of the SEC, was one of the chairs of the SEC, was on the FTC Commission, was later, at some point was Dean of the Harvard Law School. He has a wonderful little book from the late 30s that says it's all to do with expertise. And our society and our economy has just become too complicated for, he doesn't put it like this, but the constitutional structure bequeathed to us by Locke and Montesquieu and Madison. And then we need to kind of junk the separation of powers. Instead, we need to have subject specialist agencies that are close, but square brackets, too close to the industries that they regulate. And they will articulate policy by setting rules and check compliance and enforce the rules. And politics shouldn't be allowed in. He changed his mind slightly later. He was an advisor to President-elect Kennedy. But at this point, he believed that it's all to do with expertise. I think that this argument, it won't do at all. The argument that the importance of expertise entails that you're fully insulated from politics and that you make the policy decision doesn't run at all. Because what you could have is an independent commission, fully insulated from politics, and what it does is publish advice to the cabinet member for whatever. And actually in the UK, monetary policy was made through that kind of system between the early 1990s and the late 1990s. There was a committee of the Bank of England that would publish its advice to the finance minister, who would then decide on interest rates. And it probably wasn't as effective as what came next, which was a fully independent central bank, but it was hugely better than what had come over the previous 20 years, because the minister was somewhat constrained by the expert published advice of the Bank of England. The missing ingredient And I think this is where one can draw something from monetary policy literature, is the importance of making credible commitments. In some, not hugely in all, but in many areas of public policy, it matters, the effectiveness of the policy turns to a significant degree on people, us, citizens, businesses, believing that the policymaker will keep their promise. This is very obvious in monetary policy. If I say I'm going to achieve 2% inflation, but that you actually believe I'm not going to keep that promise, that I'm going to achieve 10% inflation, in your wage bargains, you will want compensation for 10% inflation, not compensation for 2% inflation. If you strike, you're the businesses, you're the workers. If you strike a bargain that is 8% or 9%, it's very hard for me then to deliver 2% inflation without creating a massive recession. You think I won't create a massive recession because the costs of doing so, economic and political. Now, that kind of the dynamic of expectations are not people believing in promises. Promises being credible is by no means restricted to central banking. So what's going on here? So why would delegation help? It's something to do with the incentives of the elected politician and the unelected technocrat. Now, the obvious point is the one about the elected politician. The elected politician is going to be running for re-election, and they want to be popular in the short run. They don't just. And most politicians I've known think that politics is path dependent. So even if you're 2 to 3 years away from an election, or here with the House, 1 year away from an election, and you become deeply unpopular, you aren't confident that you're going to get back. You actually want to lift your popularity more or less immediately so as to stay on the right glide path for your election. That much is kind of intuitive. But why should we trust the unelected technocrat to stick to their promises? And this bit rarely gets debated in the economic literature at all. It's touched on slightly more than touched on in some papers by Alberto Alessina and Guido Tabellini, but it opens the door to thinking more deeply about what's going on, which is that I think it is predicated on a view that we can harness the incentives, the behavior of the technocrat, to how they feel, to caring about their public and professional reputation for delivering the job they've been given to do. If they either don't care about their professional and public reputation, or they do care about it, but it isn't going to be determined by them delivering the job they've been given to do, then I don't think delegation will work. And so this turns on both societies being capable of bestowing esteem, which is kind of drawing on an old Republican idea of honor. And it obviously means that the regime must be designed in a way where the objective, the job that the technocrat is given, is clear. Now, what I do in my book, and I'm going to skim over this very quickly and then go through some of the principles, is what I do is that I kind of set out where economics would take you in terms of a series of principles for delegation, and I've hinted at some of them there. And then I say, well, but do those principles of delegation stack up with our deep political values, the values of democracy and the rule of law and constitutionalism, and to what extent do the principles need embellishing in the light of those political values? And it turns out that they do, and as I go through the political values in each case, I don't take one off-the-shelf view of democracy or one off-the-shelf view of the rule of law. And in terms of how my book functions, that's really important, because typically what people do, an author will have a view of human nature, and therefore a view of what democracy really means, and therefore a view of what that entails for whatever they want to discuss. And I want to say, no, this isn't monolithic. We have liberal traditions, we have Republican traditions, we have conservative with a small c conditions, and these traditions are held in various different degrees by different parts of our society. And our principles of delegation are going to have to stack up against more or less all of them. So let me quickly go through some of the principles for delegation, and then if I've got enough time, I will say something about how it might matter for central banking. So first of all, criteria for whether or not to delegate to an insulated agency. This isn't how to do so, but whether or not to do so at all. So the first would be that there should be broadly settled public preferences for the purpose of the delegation. That sounds completely innocuous, but I don't think is. So if you take environmental policy here in this country, lots of people, probably lots of people at this university, have lamented the course of EPA policy since the 2016 election. But there are actually lots of people out there in the country who applaud it. I mean, there is not a consensus around environmental policy. I mean, lots of people feel that there should be, but in one direction or the other. Whereas if you go to the other extreme, there is not a constituency, other than perhaps a few hedge fund people, there is not a constituency out there for high and variable inflation. Or let's have more financial crises. Or when we have them, can they be even deeper? I mean, if you ask, just a regular person, would you like financial crises? The answer is going to be no. I don't really want that. Would you like lots of inflation? They're not going to say yes. Whereas, perhaps sadly, environmental policy is still somewhat contested, perhaps particularly in this society. The second one should be that there is a problem of credible commitment. A third one should be, this does a lot of work, because credible commitment problems are so pervasive in government, you don't want to be delegating big choices about distributional issues or about high-level values. You don't want to be delegating policy on taxation or on social security. Now, what about how? In many ways, the most important thing is that the legislature, after public debate, sets a clear objective that can be monitored. And this has all sorts of implications. It can help protect against or insulate against capture by the industry, because people like you, people like us, can identify whether the agency has departed from achieving its objective. It's very important that the objective should be monitorable. No, that's not what they were meant to be doing. They've done something else to please their friends in industry, or please their friends in Congress or Parliament or the Prime Minister's office or whatever. And for those of you that are public lawyers, what this amounts to is saying that the old non-delegation doctrine, which applied to all agencies, irrespective of the degree of insulation from politics, should actually be recast to apply only actually to independent agencies insulated from both branches, elected branches of government. A second set of principles would be, you don't want to delegate these kind of extraordinary powers to one person, but you want to delegate to committees who reach their decisions after deliberation and with a vote, because this disperses power, a good Republican value. It aids public debate by revealing disagreement. There's an element of liberal and Republican values there, and it also ensures that you're more likely to pursue the objective that you've been set, because one policymaker has greater freedom to depart from the objective than a room of 5 policymakers, where you can call out your colleagues. When the Bank of England, as an aside, when the Bank of England was designed, we very much wanted there to be a committee, precisely so that it would protect us, it would discipline us to stick to the job that we've been given to do. Especially when it comes to regulatory powers, you need a principle of what the Germans would call proportionality, which is spread through the European world and will feature here increasingly, which is given all regulation is is an interference with liberal freedoms, do the least that is needed to deliver the objective that you've been given. Don't hit a problem with a sledgehammer unless you really need a sledgehammer. You know, if you can solve a problem in a gentle way, solve it in a gentle way. If you do have to interfere in a more thoroughgoing way, and that's what you've been mandated to do, and it's the only way of achieving it, then that's the thing to do. Let me just say something about emergencies, and then something about multiple mission agencies. There is a real problem with emergencies. There is a view, perhaps held particularly in this country, I don't hold it, that first part of which is less controversial. It's that when an emergency of some kind happens, Congress isn't going to solve it, the court obviously isn't going to solve it, and therefore there is only the executive. The executive is the only, as I put it in the book, the executive is the only 24/7 branch. That's not so controversial. The second part of it is, yes, but within the executive, it's hard for the elected people to do things, and therefore the unelected people should do it. And this is particularly true in my former world. The Federal Reserve should be expected to recast itself as the US Cavalry, because it's hard for the Treasury Secretary to do so. It's hard for the President to do so. It exposes them to risk, and the Fed should just do it, and people will shout afterwards. And my response is, well, it depends. First of all, they shouldn't go beyond their legal powers. We could talk a bit about that. And so you have a question of what happens when they're at the edge of their legal powers, but could do more. And my answer to that is, well, then they themselves shouldn't rewrite their mandate. There should be some ex-ante provision where the executive branch can extend their powers. But the other would be when you're actually within your legal powers, but the thing that you're contemplating doing has never been contemplated by anybody ever before. That people are going to go, wow, they could do that. And they say, oh yes, I see it was in the law, but we didn't know they could set negative interest rates, or that they could, or whatever. And I think in those circumstances, even though you're within your legal powers, you need somehow to have, to consult with the elected executive branch and ensure that you have some kind of political cover. And both those views, in different degrees, are controversial in my community of former policymakers. The other thing about multiple mission constraints, which in central banking comes back to, is it okay to have the monetary policy authority in the same building under the same people as the regulator of banks in that case? I argue for the following set of conditions. First of all, the missions better be intimately intertwined, not just, well, they seem to be good at what they do, let's give them some more functions. I mean, there are some institutions that are just terribly good. I think the institution that I was part of is terribly good. I mean, that doesn't mean it should be in charge of, I don't know, utility regulation or something like that. And I think if it were, I suspect it would do a better job than some other agency. They'd just be too powerful. And the intimately intertwined, and you'll get you have an expectation of better results from joint production. But here's where the extra ingredient comes in, and this is what we did in the UK when the Bank of England got extra powers, and we did it for these reasons, and I know that because I'm the architect of this part of the UK structure. That if you have separate mandates, you should have separate policy committees. Each of those separate policy committees should have a majority of members who are on that committee and on no other committee. And what's going on here is if you've got two missions and one person or the same body of people responsible for everything, the political science literature, both empirical and formal analytical, makes it pretty clear that the policymakers will put most effort, will prioritize the mission that is most salient. So in my former world, that's monetary policy. Monetary policy seems to be of great fascination to the newspapers and the media and the public all the time, because it affects people's mortgage rates and their savings rates. Banking regulation becomes incredibly salient after crises, and then gradually loses salience as the as the years pass. And for what it's worth, I believe that one of the contributors to the financial crisis was that Alan Greenspan's Fed was not sufficiently interested in financial regulation because he personally wasn't sufficiently interested in it. So I think the world has paid a price for the kind of incentive problems that Wilson and Holmstrom have described, whereas in my setup, Alan would have been going to meetings where he'd have been in a minority doing monetary policy and regulatory policy. There would have been a majority of people doing regulatory policy who did that and that alone. And I think everybody's conduct will be different under those circumstances. I don't want to, I'm not making an ad hominem comment about Greenspan. I think the same problems arose elsewhere in different ways. So I could let me give an example on prudential supervision, a quick comment about central banking, and then I'll stop. So here's a remarkable thing about prudential supervision of banks. So the international acquis enforced around the world by the IMF, by the Basel Committee, is that it is absolutely essential that the supervisors of banks should be independent, because you don't want politics interfering with the regulation of individual banks. There's a famous case, famous episode in the US from about 30 years ago. The late John McCain was sadly involved in this, where there was a savings and loans on the West Coast, and the owner was very influential in Congress, and I think 5 senators lent on the regulatory body to go soft on the firm in question. The firm in question, by the way, I think they did go a bit softer. The firm in question failed. The pressure was completely inappropriate. I think it's exactly what you would expect in those kinds of circumstances.
And it was a scandalous failure.
Yes, yes.
Failure.
Yeah, it was a really terrible failure. Absolutely. And McCain handled it pretty well because he did mea culpa. He didn't say, oh no,
And he was
really
least
happened.
involved with the file.
Yeah, and he was kind of right out there, least involved and most upfront about kind of hands up. So it's generally agreed these things should be independent. That's kind of in the international concordats and all that kind of stuff. As a community, they also say, by the way, we can't tell you anything about what we're doing because it's so sensitive that if we published what we were doing, it would bring about the very problem, bank failures, that we exist to avert. So this is the ultimate trust us regime. Insulate us from politics. We can't tell you what we're doing because it's far too sensitive and delicate. You can't hold us to account except when it goes wrong. And I think this is just wrong. And this wasn't, thank God, in terms of my own self-esteem, this was something I had grasped before I left office. I became a fan of much greater transparency and prudential supervision. Let me say something about constitutional central banking, and then finally something about the lender of last resort. I'm going to offer a completely different argument for central banking than the normal short-termism one. Or at least it's a constitutionalist twist on that argument. So, what is the basic separation of powers between the legislature and the executive branch of government about? And this is as true in the Westminster parliamentary system as it is here, and it was as true when Simon de Montfort was creating pressure for an English parliament as it is however many years, 700 years, no, 500 years later, 600 years later. It's that we think that somehow the people that set our taxes should be representative in some way. It should be a representative assembly. Now, the monetary policy instrument is latently an instrument of taxation. It's not used like that most of the time, but it can be. If the Fed tomorrow increases the money supply enormously and promises to keep it out there forever, prices will rise. In the short run, inflation will rise. There will be a transfer of resources between debtors and creditors, assuming they have nominal contracts. If it chooses the steady state rate of inflation, it chooses the rate of the inflation tax. We don't want unelected people doing that, but nor do we want the executive branch doing that because it's a tax. And so the last group of people on this view of monetary policy, that should be in charge of monetary policy, are the elected executive branch. You should not want the president or the prime minister setting monetary policy. You're going to say, bloody hell, who should do it then? Well, the world of the gold standard cured this because everyone was constrained to set a parliament or Congress legislated the gold standard, and everybody had to stick to the gold standard. It was a rule. Now, I don't believe that we could have anything remotely like the gold standard in today's full franchise democracies. The world of the gold standard was very effective in terms of price stability. The economy tended to lurch around from the recessions were deeper, and the people that were most hurt by those recessions were, guess what, the non-property owners who didn't have a vote. So I don't think we could operate the gold standard in today's world. And in a sense, central bank independence is a way of trying to synthesize a commitment device that respects the separation of powers between the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government. Final thing. So why should the central bank also be the regulator, which it is in this country and is now in Europe and the United Kingdom? And I think it comes back to my test of, are they intimately intertwined? So the biggest problem in banking is bank runs. And bank runs occur when there's a crisis of confidence. And in the short run, all you can do to contain the crisis is have the central bank lend to the distressed bank so that the distressed bank can meet its obligations as they are falling due, the acceleration of them being claimed. Also, the monetary policy maker is the only person that can do that because they're the only person that can create money. And yet now they are appearing, it's like a Gestalt thing. One day they're a monetary policy maker, the next day they're a liquidity reinsurer. Well, the liquidity reinsurer faces all sorts of problems of moral hazard and adverse selection, like any insurer. And so they want to be involved in being able to monitor the state of the banks who are eligible to borrow from them. And they want a stake, they should rationally want a stake in setting the rules of the game for banking. I don't think this means that the central bank should necessarily be the unique bank regulator, but it means, I think, that it is a great mistake for the central bank not to be involved in bank regulation and bank supervision at all, which is actually the position that prevailed in much of Europe before the crisis. But if you are going to have them both, then I go back to you need separate committees. You need a committee for monetary policy, and you need a committee for banking regulation. And on each committee, you need a majority of people that do only that. There's more to be said, but the whole point of presenting a book is just to glance over a lot of things that one tries to say more carefully in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Certainly, you've given us a lot to think about. If I was, contemplating the themes in your book, it seems to me that I mean, obviously, legitimacy is an overriding theme. And the theme that also struck me was accountability, that you can't have legitimacy without accountability. And you can't have accountability without transparency. I often say, well, everybody wants accountability and transparency for the other guy, not for themselves.
That's right.
But I mean, I think that when the political movements we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic have a lot to do with, what people feel that some parts of the government are unaccountable to them. And they can't even understand what the government's doing. It's non-transparent. So I think legitimacy, accountability, transparency are tremendously important. And I think your book does a wonderful job in putting those front and center. Now, as you've already indicated, when you get to central banks, these principles are difficult, right? Because we sort of think central banks, I think most of us agree on the monetary policy side, they shouldn't be accountable strictly, except under general principles, because if they were too accountable, they would be pushed probably to inflate most of the time. On the supervisory side, you have the transparency problem, which you've teed up, which is we don't see bank supervision in real time, right?
Yeah.
You know, we see the results of it later.
Yeah.
And you sort of indicated you would like to have a more transparent supervisory process. Can you imagine how that would be implemented? Because obviously you're not going to publish bank exams, presumably, except for some period after. But how would you improve transparency and supervision?
Well, let me go back first of all to what you say about accountability and monetary policy. So I think we have to distinguish between accountability for individual decisions,
Right.
in the sense of the political principle has a reserve power to ultimately control,
Right.
on the one hand, and on the other hand, accountability in the sense of giving an account
Right.
that enables Congress or Parliament or whatever to decide whether they want to carry on with the regime. And I describe towards the end of my book an episode that happened when Mervyn King and I, the former governor of the Bank of England, and I were testifying to the UK Parliament sometime after the crisis. Not actually about the crisis, about QE or something like that, I think, about quantitative easing. And the ranking member, what you would call the ranking member, George Moody, said, "Mr. King, Mr. Tucker, remember this is in front of television cameras and all that kind of stuff. You come along here and we ask you these questions, and you give us eloquent, erudite answers, and then you go back to your building, and none of it makes any difference whatsoever. You just do whatever you were going to do or thought you were going to do anyway. What is the point of all of this?"
Is it a kabuki show, right?
Yes,
Right.
yes. And Mervyn and I mean, him at greater length, my rather shorter one, unlike here, the number 2 or the number 3 or number 4, you give your answer. You are not there to say, "Oh, the chair's right." So if I hadn't agreed with him, I would have said, well, I'd put it slightly differently. Actually, we gave the same answer, which is essentially, yes, you're right in the sense that Parliament has decided that we're independent. And it is for us, so long as that is the law, it is for us to go back and set interest rates where we think they should be set. But these hearings are about describing how we go about our job and the results and the side effects and everything else, so that you can decide whether to carry on with this independent central bank regime at all. Parliament gave it, created it, and Parliament can take it away. And actually, we didn't feel it was our job to defend central bank independence. And I think in some other, I'm going to put this slightly carefully, I think in some other jurisdictions, the office holders in central banks and in other agencies somehow feel it's for them to defend.
Like institutional.
And we didn't. We didn't feel that, even though the institution has a 300-year-old identity, and it has a very strong identity internally, but we didn't think it was for us to. We thought being sufficiently transparent that they could decide
Right.
was vital. Related to that, and then I'll come to supervision. I had a striking conversation with some former presidents of the Bundesbank, the German central bank. For our generation, we know that in the 1970s, during the inflationary 1970s, the only central banks that did a good job, actually a half-decent job, in the Western world were the Bundesbank in Germany and the Swiss National Bank in Switzerland. And it wasn't that anybody else did quite a good job, everyone else did a lousy job. So the Bundesbank is, it's a great...
The Germans remember the inflation of the 20s.
They
right?
did.
Yeah,
Well, for whatever reason, they did a good job. So I asked these presidents of the Bundesbank, do you testify to the Bundestag on monetary policy, and should you? And the answer was, no, we do not, and no, we should not, because it would undermine our independence. Wow. Whereas the view at the Bank of England was, yes, we do, and yes, we should, because it underpins our independence. And I'm not sure that the deep political culture of England and Germany is so different that these positions can be reconciled. Now on supervision, so something has to be done. Something I touch on in the book only briefly, and in some respects maybe I should have said a little bit more about, is that If we can't make it more transparent, then at the very least, we should have a system of congressional testimony, parliamentary testimony, in camera, in secret, in the way that works for the security and intelligence services. A world in which years or decades can go by with nobody elected really knowing what you're doing actually is a recipe for one of two things. One is that you just become detached.
Right.
The other is actually that the executive branch quietly oversees you and steers you behind the scenes, even though that's what no one wrote on the tin, but that's how it was meant to work. So my fallback would be, if we can do that for security and intelligence policy, and we do it tolerably well in those fields, and people don't leak great secrets all of the time, we could do that. But actually, I think it could just be more transparent. I think the stress tests that the Federal Reserve introduced have made it more transparent, and I think they could publish a great deal more of what they do, and I think I would like them to be under more pressure to do so, and I'd like them to debate that more. And actually, the current Fed leadership, Vice Chair Pauls, certainly has given speeches talking about that, and the new chair of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, has, I believe, talked about that in public over the last week or so. So I think this is.
Might be moving.
I think this is good.
So one question with the, and I don't pretend to understand the intricacies of the Taylor rule, but one answer on the monetary policy side is to set a rule like the Taylor rule, and maybe not make it absolutely binding, but say, justify why you're not following it. Do you think that's even possible for a monetary authority to think about doing?
Yes, I do. I think it's important, though, what strings it's attached to. So first of all, although I don't couch it in terms of John Taylor's rule, I am against the legislature mandating a rule that they themselves do not understand.
Right.
So I've just argued that entirely on democratic principles.
Right.
I'm not resting that on views about the substance of monetary policy at all, which is, as a citizen, I really do not want people I vote for to impose on other bodies, you shall follow this rule, unless they could go on television and explain why that is the rule and why not some other rule, and the circumstances in which the rule won't work and the circumstances in which it won't work, to an average member of the public who is interested in the subject but not remotely expert in it. I can't see that we can be well governed if, and actually I think people in the Westminster Parliament in the 19th century who legislated the gold standard, I think they could have done it. Right. I think the Taylor rule, as it happens, is rather harder to
more complex, right?
Because it's based around variables that are unobservable and in some sense are imaginary, right, which is the equilibrium rate of interest and the equilibrium rate of unemployment, which people like me happily swim around that territory. But I've watched central bankers try and explain to smart business people. Right. And on one occasion, a friend of mine, a businessman, said, "So this art star thing, it's imaginary."
He flushed it out.
Yeah. So there's that. In particular variant, when it was going through the Fed, when it was going through Congress here, it depends what strings it's attached with. And the idea was that the Fed should explain why it's not following the rule, and approximating more or less any member of Congress or a congressional committee should be capable of mandating GAO to audit the Fed. So this is just a way. This is just a way of ganging up.
Of taking away the independence, then. Right.
And it came from a particular part of politics, and I always thought the thing had to be explained to them properly, because their wing of politics would not want 50 basis points on or 25 basis points on bond yields. I thought it was a proposal that went through Congress, and I thought that their experts on their own side haven't explained this to them. If they understood this, they are the last people.
Would you see some kind of, perhaps, benchmark that might work?
I think whether it's legislated or not, I think it is useful for central banks to explain what they're doing relative to rules. Before I was a confirmed policymaker, for a while I was one of the people that briefed the UK's Monetary Policy Committee. I was head of a division called Monetary Assessment and Strategy, and each month I presented what the Taylor Rule was saying and what the McCullum Rule was saying, and I'm not sure we had any others that we looked at, but and that was kind of reflected in some published
Right, briefing papers.
yeah,
right,
and
right.
under Janet Yellen, the Fed started doing this. When you're faced with slightly crazy proposals, it's really important to disentangle those bits that are crazy and those bits that are good, and just do the good bit.
Right, right.
And then disarm the people that want you to.
To go much
Yeah.
over the deep end.
Yeah.
right?
So that whole debate over here was a bit peculiar.
Now I want to move to the lender of last resort, sort of emergency power side, because, you know, again, this would be something of a caricature, but the caricature argument would be the Fed played Dutch boy. And central banks, in a lot of places, play Dutch boy.
Dutch boy. This is a.
This, you're putting fingers in the dike.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that all these institutions that were floundering, no one could really tell whether they were insolvent or not. But
Yeah.
if they were big enough, the Fed would rush in and prop them up. Of course, we also helped with other things like asset guarantees and so on. And as we were talking about before the program, you know, Tim Geithner basically said, this is what you have to do, right? That all your systemic institutions, you must prop up. You can't let them fail. We saw what happened when Lehman failed. It was really messy and ugly after that. And I tend to agree with that in the midst of a crisis. But if that is your strategy, full stop, right? Are we essentially encouraging more crises and more risk taking by saying, if you're big enough, you're systemic enough, we will make sure you survive, your creditors survive the next crisis.
So there are two issues here, which is how much insurance
Should the central bank
can
provide?
well, first of all, can and should the state provide to us as citizens? And I'll say, and that your point goes to that. But then there's secondly, you kind of, your imaginary Tim said, what you have to do is what's necessary.
Right.
But the second one is, who's you? Is it the central bank, or is it the elected executive,
Yes.
or what? And
Yeah.
the book is particularly about the second type of question. But on the first, if you provide free insurance to people, they will take more of the risk, whether it's living in the floodplain
Right.
or financial risk or anything else. And that's kind of standard
Human nature. right?
stuff. It's human nature, and we understand quite a lot about moral hazard, and we don't know completely how to cure it in any field. But this is why when you buy an insurance policy, if you have a car crash, I don't know how it works. If you have a car crash, you have to pay the first time.
Deductibles,
Yourself,
right.
deductibles, and all of that.
Co-insurance,
These
right.
are all these kind of problems run through providing insurance, and rescuing people is a form of insurance. And it's partly that justifies the regulation of the financial system in the first place. The second set of issues is what can the central bank properly do? And I want to argue, and I feel very strongly about this, that it is wrong, in many senses of wrong, for the central bank to use the lender of last resort capability to bail out a firm that is fundamentally bust.
Right.
Fundamentally bust. There is no state of the world where, even after they borrow from you,
Right.
that they will be able to pay out all
It's
of
not
that.
just a time and
They will be able-
consistency problem.
that-
right,
Well, this arises from time subordination. And one of my maxims for central banking is do not lend to fundamentally insolvent borrowers. And by fundamentally insolvent, I mean there is no plausible path of the
State of the
economy and
world.
asset prices, state of the world in which they're going to be able to pay everybody out. And you can quickly do tests where, fraud has eliminated 50% of the assets of the institution, but etc. Now, why is that? Well, before we come to the law, well, it's because in life there is time subordination in the payment of debt claims, and in death, when you're on a bankruptcy proceeding or a liquidation proceeding, there is not time subordination. So you and I, you're running a bank. You and I, you've lent for you bought a 10-year bond. I've lent for 1 day. I take out my money tomorrow. Art is still there for the next
10 years.
10 years. You go bust during those 10 years. I got out. You didn't. Same contracts, just regular debt contracts. A year passes. I've rolled every night.
Right.
So it's a demand deposit, if you like. You go bust for whatever reason, and you go into a bankruptcy proceeding. You're the liquidator. You can't pay out to me until you pay out to Art. You go and work out the value of all the assets with the only criticals. This is equity holders and you and I. You go and work out the value of all the assets. We're the same rank.
Okay.
And you work out the value of all the assets, and then you
it's pro rata,
and it turns out 50% recovery, and you get 50%, and I get 50%, 50 cents in the dollar. So what does a central bank do if it lends to a fundamentally insolvent bank? It allows you to repay me, and Art is worse
Zero.
is worse off. You imagine that our deposits are the same amount. I think you can't do it in my head.
Probably I get 25. Probably.
Yeah.
You get 100. I get 25.
Either you get 25 or a third. I can't do it. How embarrassing. Anyway, you get less.
Yeah,
you are worse off.
Right.
And if I know that you're fundamentally, if the central bank knows that you're fundamentally, remember with the central bank, if you know that he's fundamentally bust, you are basically indulging in
You're subverting bankruptcy law.
In a political decision where I'm bailed out. I truly am bailed out, and you are made worse off.
Right.
So you've just done some distributional policy, and distributional policy is for elected people. Meanwhile, in most countries, I don't know about this one, if you know you're fundamentally bust, you've broken the law. In the UK, this would be called fraudulent preference. If you borrow from the central bank to repay me, when you know you're bust, you've committed a crime.
Right. It's an illegal preference, fraudulent conveyance, or different words they use for it. Right.
Now, and what that says to me is that even when it isn't illegal it's not actually illegal for you to do so,
The central bank
to do so, it's fundamentally wrong. I mean, the norms in our society can be seen in the law that it's illegal for you, and you should
private parties couldn't.
You should not be aiding and abetting you doing something illegal because you're unelected. If the elected person over there wants to do that because they have judged that this is in the broader interests of the society, I think the argument is different. But for you, I think it's a no-no. Now this has real. We've plodded through the example, and I still haven't been able to work out the 25% thing in my head while I've been talking. But this has real traction because there is a perception, fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, I genuinely don't know, that the Federal Reserve did this. And that has created enemies for the Federal Reserve on both the left of politics and on the right of politics. And when people say they bailed out Wall Street, there are many things that are covered by that, but it shades into this, God, they did something that they just shouldn't do. And I want central banks I want them to wear this on their sleeve. We will not do this. Now, judging whether or not...
You would go back to Bagehot's rule fairly
Well, some people
strongly understood.
Some people say Badgett didn't say what I said. Larry Ball has a book out where apparently he's got a footnote saying I misunderstood Badgett. We could talk about that.
Okay, yeah. Right.
I doubt.
I read Badgett the way you do.
Oh well, Badgett was writing in after an episode in the UK
Sure.
where the Bank of England let someone fail, and we could, anyway. I want central banks to announce that they will not do this.
So just one twist, and we'll turn to the audience, because I think it's sort of the twist that made the outrage much bigger, which is then the Fed engaged in quantitative easing, which is buying a lot of assets, longer-term assets, to push down interest rates. And there were those who said that those who benefited most from quantitative easing in this country were Wall Street, who were exposed to a lot of underwater, longer-term assets, which gained in value as the rates went down, and other indebted investors, whereas savers and other people suffered. Now that again is somewhat of a caricature, but do you see some of these perceptions as being in any way grounded in reality about quantitative easing and how it's played out, that it pushed up asset prices for those who had assets? Those who didn't have assets didn't gain at all. You can argue that society was better off with having interest rates down, but what do you think about that argument?
Okay, first of all, I want to come back to the thought experiment. You don't get anything. So there was 100 units of debt.
Yeah, that's what I get zero.
You've got a recovery of 50%.
Right.
So we each get half of what we
50-50.
But if I get all of mine, there's absolutely nothing.
I don't even get 25
whatsoever.
Right.
I'm sorry for not doing that more quickly in my mind, but it shows you why this matters.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a lot less off. You are definitely better off going into bankruptcy, even if bankruptcy destroys worth. Even if, in that example, even if bankruptcy means that the recovery diminishes somewhat because of forced sales and so on,
right.
You are still better off. Whereas, of course, I'm better off just escaping. And so to QE. So I think a whole bunch of things about this. I think QE had distributional effects. And I'm a bit dismayed that my former colleagues keep on wanting to lean against this, but they lean against a very rarefied version of it. Did QE help avoid the economy on both sides of the Atlantic from disappearing into a vortex with an even greater destruction of jobs? I'm sure that it did.
Probably helped, right.
And we didn't have the Great Depression. That's an absolutely massive thing. And the Great Depression hurt people on lower incomes a lot more than it hurt people on middling or high income. So in that sense, QE, I wouldn't particularly want to put it like this, but it helped the poorer parts of society. But it also, of course, pushed up asset prices, which helped the rich part of society, and it depressed returns.
Savings, ordinary savings.
It depressed the running return on savings, which is a kind of middling part of advanced economy societies. People by the way, have a very high propensity to vote.
Right.
And so it
certainly seems to affect the pensions, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So, but in my book, I draw a distinction between independent agencies having distributional effects and making distributional choices. I do not believe anyone went into those meetings and said, "Hey, let's help the poor and the rich and screw the middle."
Right.
I don't think that's what's going on. They thought, we're at the zero lower bound. Fiscal policymakers aren't doing anything.
Right.
It'd be a really good idea for the economy as a whole, society as a whole, not to disappear into the vortex of the Great Depression.
This is the best we can do.
And it was the best we can do, and actually there's very few things that we can do. So it's I don't even think this is a subtle distinction, but I think making distributional choices and just having distributional
sort of collateral effects
are different things. Whereas when you think about politics, the debate is about
Who gets what, right?
it's overtly, it's who do we want to help? Different political parties have different constituencies. I think the central bankers were thinking, we really, we want to have our constituency at the poor and the rich, and we can alienate the middling people because they're not part of our thing. That's not what was going on. I think it does mean, by the way, that in many respects it would have been better had there been a longer and more powerful fiscal response, particularly probably in this country where you have the fiscal capacity to do so, but not the political capacity. I don't disagree with the people in the Obama administration who say that Congress wasn't going to do more. I think that had Congress done more, and needn't even have been debt financed if we tax financed, there is a need to improve infrastructure. It would have probably improved the productive capacity of the economy. It would have meant that the yield curve was upward sloping so that it would mean less financial exuberance, and it would have had quite, and they would have been choosing distribution effects, and the right people would have been choosing.
Right, the middle income people would have been employed doing the work, right?
And they'd have been slightly better off actually.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience. I've got a couple more things in mind, but I invite you to ask some questions.
I'm so happy you brought back the budget reform, because I think that was in the core of the crisis management discussion in the US during the 2008 crisis. And my question is that basically the budget reform, according to which in crisis central banks should lend early, freely, against good collateral, with penalty rate, and solvent companies.
To sound it first,
Solvent.
she says,
Yes, exactly. So, taking into consideration that, is it correct to say that the previous in your book is not in contradiction with budget reform?
No, I don't think it's in contradiction at all. I think Magic got his dictum from the institution I served, and so did I. It's worth telling the story of what happened in 1866, 1867. I've only felt the need to do this since I realized that Larry Ball said that I misunderstand budget, so I'm pretty sure I did. What happened was a massive, truly massive non-bank intermediary called Overend and Gurney failed. And the Bank of England did rescue it, and there was absolute mayhem.
It was a little bit like Lehman, I mean, in some ways, right?
Yeah, absolute mayhem. And it then lent to more or less everybody else. And the interesting thing about the decision not to lend to Overend and Gurney was that they put in 3 people to have a look at Overend and Gurney and its whether or not it was sound or unsound, including, I think, 2 former governors or 2 former deputy governors and one of the then current officers. Now, on a view that all that matters is whether you've got good collateral or not, you do not need to go and have a look at the bank. Because the bank that wants the money, or they just come and present you with the collateral. You never look beyond the collateral. And if they've got good collateral, you lend to them, and if they haven't got good collateral, you don't lend to them. Whereas if you have the view that having good collateral is not sufficient to decide to lend, because you want to know whether the bank is sound, then you better go and have a look at it. And there is no reason for them. I mean, the idea of getting, whether it's former deputy governors or governors, doesn't matter, but the idea of getting people of that seniority to go and have a look at the bank means that there's a lot more going on than have they got good collateral, because they can walk that round from Lombard Street to, which like kind of, they're going from H Street to I. And so I am absolutely convinced that soundness mattered to people. Also, it's also...
So Badger criticized them for letting Overend go?
No,
he thought it was okay.
What he does, he doesn't really talk about that,
Right.
What he does is he praises them for lending to everybody else.
Once the crisis opened up. Right.
What Badger wants them to do is to commit to lend. And the then governor attacked Badger for saying, what if we, this goes back to your point about moral hazard, if we commit to lend, then we just encourage risk taking. And my view is, yeah, if you can put this together, you commit to lend to a sound bank, subject to all of that. But you say, I will not lend to a bank that is unsound. And the only difference between my formulation of it and Badger's is that I want to substitute the word insolvent, or fundamentally insolvent, for unsound.
Right.
Because, a century and a half on, we can do a little bit better.
We can explain
That's
what
the
that
extent to
means.
which we've advanced in the last 150 years.
Other questions? Yes.
To what extent, in a political society, potentially like the United States, where economic policy is often bastardized, especially amongst the public when it comes to political debate, could it be important to preserve a level of undemocraticness to make sure that the long-term macroeconomic goals, especially for the health of not just the American economy, but the global economy, can be preserved? Because I can think of at least one instance when it came to the debt ceiling in the United States in 2012, where there was a fundamental misunderstanding purposefully perpetuated throughout political discourse. And to what extent could that happen if you open up too much transparency into what the central banks are doing?
So, this is a really great question. So generically, my answer is yes. This is the kind of question I'm really interested in. I think that what our institutions are can be viewed as there's a variety of commitment devices with different degrees of entrenchment. And so a central bank created by an ordinary statute is different from a central bank where they don't have any formal independence, but the minister has
It's under his thumb, right?
the minister has said, I'll let you decide. So that's Canada, by the way. That's not very effective. That's short. That's way short of having it in primary legislation, where changing the law incurs all its costs and everything else is not the same as having it in the written constitution. And if it's in the written constitution, it's not the same as having it as an immutable provision of a written constitution. The German constitution has some provisions that cannot be amended.
Wow.
That doesn't apply to in Europe. The ECB is in a treaty, which is like
Takes unanimous consent to change it, right?
It's exactly. So it's somewhere between. It's de jure not immutable.
But de facto.
De facto is pretty close to immutable. So you can got a spectrum of things. Another question is which particular parts of public policy making do you want to slot in to the different degrees of entrenchment? So you want an independent judiciary right up there towards that end, and I would say you don't want the central bank right up to that. The important thing is that what you want entrenched and how far you want it entrenched, I think is a matter of, in a democratic society, is a matter of public debate itself. So I think your description of a hazard here is, I wouldn't want to dissent from that. But it would be quite something to say we want to entrench fiscal capacity and separate it from Congress. Because in some respects, the very historical roots of having a representative assembly is
The king imposing taxes, right?
is to separate fiscal policy from the king, is to separate fiscal policy from the president. I think, I touch on this towards the end of my book, I think we are much closer to answers around monetary policy and lender of last resort and utility regulation and securities regulation, even though they're still highly contested, than we are around. So I think that people have struggled to come up with fiscal rules that they are capable of sticking to. They've not been incentive compatible. And it would be a hell of a thing to put a fiscal rule into a constitution that actually you truly didn't want to stick to ex post, because actually it turned out it was a bad thing to do ex post. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that's a framework for thinking about it.
Yeah, so there's typically an inverse correlation between public knowledge of government operations and public perception and favorability of the government, specifically when it comes to Congress and the judiciary. Now, holding this true for monetary policy, do you think greater transparency and public knowledge of the operations of central banks could lead to a public backlash and outcry against these same central banks, thus diminishing the autonomy and independence necessary to implement proper monetary policy?
So without great conviction, I want to say no. And as you were speaking, the thing that came to my mind about this country is the standing of the military. Standing of the military, compared to when we were young, it's high. And I would suggest to you that many families across this nation have a reasonable understanding of the military because they have sons and daughters, or they themselves, brothers, sisters, who've been in the military. At all sorts of different ranks in all sorts of different roles. And that would be circumstances where knowledge is not bred contempt. But if anything, one of the reasons that I think views of the military, not restricted to this country, on both sides of the Atlantic, have changed, is because, I mean, it's by definition an extremely dangerous walk of life. But people seem to be tolerant and understanding of officers and military leaders. They understand that they make hard decisions, and sometimes they turn out to be wrong. And this speaks to me in terms of you know, it helps to suggest that knowing about stuff doesn't mean the public lose faith in it. I also, I think there's a long-standing theme of political science here, which kind of Lippmann was part of, and others, which is, you know, the public is stupid and you can't tell them things. I must say, I think this is absolute nonsense. I used to, when I was a junior official, I used to go into work on the bus, and not infrequently I'd sit on the top of the bus and I'd hear conversations amongst members of the general public about some aspect of public policy, not particularly ones I was involved with, and I think, well, that's just as good as the dinner tables that I sit at.
Right, they were well informed. Yeah.
Why should it be any other way? I think they're kind of, you know, I wasn't a politician, I was a public servant, but I do not think that people are stupid, and I don't think they're ignorant.
If they're given, hopefully, good information.
Oh, I think if you don't give them information, they have to guess. Right. And then, given, if you put that together with things go wrong, I mean, I believe in both market failure and government failure. Any part of government, occasionally go wrong, sometimes for not acceptable reasons, sometimes for reasons that we have to be understanding of. If you don't give them any information and then things inevitably go wrong, it can look like anything from absolutely abject structural incompetence to
some kind of conspiracy
or whatever. So I do think it's tremendously important that leading public officials should have a capacity of explaining their policies in words that an interested non-expert can understand. One of the things that surprised me, we lived here more or less full time for 2 years when I first left office, and we're at Harvard now. We come and go. We live in London. But I was surprised how infrequently I saw the leadership of the Federal Reserve on American television.
Right. Well, Bernanke did that, and he was quite reluctant to do it, you know, during the crisis. I mean, he did it, and he probably had to, but it was...
He went on 60 Minutes,
yeah,
and I remember my thought when Ben did that, and it was here it was kind of, you know, Ben Bernanke's doing this, I thought, they just started doing that. I mean... No, that was almost unheard of. But then you had Greenspan, who was... You mustn't compete with the politicians. If you compete with the politicians in their own game, you change who you are. You mustn't hide away, and you must try and explain. And something that's very hard to do in the field I was in, my colleague and boss, Mervyn King, was brilliant at it, is you can describe military policy in the seminar room at MIT or here, or expert journalists, or in the pub or on television. And you obviously have to use different language. you mustn't change the substance of what you say. You mustn't. And that's really, really hard. It is very tempting when the audience is different and you put it crudely, you dumb down a bit, that's fine. But you change the substance 5 degrees in the process, that's not fine. To keep the substance the same at different levels of technical complexity, that's a skill. And it's a hard skill to develop.
Then you had Greenspan, who quite deliberately was going to be the Oracle of Delphi, right? Which I thought was
A mistake.
Yeah, I think it. I mean,
That was a mistake.
It made him a sort of a Yoda, a guru. But I mean, did it really advance the interests of the Fed?
No, it was a mistake because no one can be a Yoda or a guru. And so if you carry on long enough, you're going to get found out. But even if you are a Yoda or a guru, you're also a public official of democracy. And I think standards have changed about this, but they changed quite a long time ago. And we have something I try and do in the book. I don't know how successfully. Is I want to argue that we've been debating the position in our society of the military and the judiciary for 250, 300 years, and I do not mean because America's existed for 200, 300 years. We were debating it too, famously in England's, and I mean England's 17th century. But we've had settled views on judicial independence, on what we should do, and military dependence for a long time. And with judiciary, and settled back some military, that goes to the kind of spectrum of independence and retrenchment. We want courts to be open. We want to hear the arguments on both sides. We want justice to be seen to be done, rather than just to be done. And if you when you separate government power, what central banking is, what independent regulators are, from politicians we elect, it becomes more important that be a bit more like an open court.
Other questions? Yeah, how much time do we have, Jeremy? Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two if there is one. I have one.
Okay, Jeremy?
I wonder if I could ask you to talk a little more explicitly about your how you feel about technocratic expertise, or perhaps we should say more generally, specialized expertise. Your story starts by noting that the original rationale for delegation to independent agencies was the value of, or even the necessity for, technocratic expertise to run a state in the modern world. And you then describe ways in which the rationale has shifted over time, but and you give a complicated and interesting argument for countering or making more nuanced that rationale. But there's another reading of the sort of story of technocratic expertise in contemporary democracies, which is that the contemporary lesser degree of deference to technocratic expertise in 2018 is obviously it's part of a longer term phenomenon, but one of the factors, or two of the factors that have contributed to it, particularly in our two countries, have been not only the financial crisis, but wars that were less successful than we expected. You know, we did a measurement of the degree to which technocratic expertise is respected, you know, in 2000 versus 2018, you know, we would see I think we would see some of the events. And so my question is your argument, I understand your argument from democratic principles and constitutional principles for limiting delegation. But are you, by doing that, are you sort of deliberately bypassing a direct reckoning with how valuable technocratic expertise is. You made the distinction a few minutes ago between its value with respect to monetary policy versus fiscal policy. Are there some things where experts know better and other things where experts should acknowledge the limits of knowledge, of specialized expertise?
So there's a lot packed in there, which is neat. So picking out just at a random point of your question. So the distinction between fiscal and monetary for me is about distributional choice. And distributional choice isn't intrinsically about technocratic judgment. It involves some technocratic judgment because I want to, I'm a politician, I want to pursue a policy P that will enrich this side of the room relative to that side of the room. Well, so I pull my lever, P, and actually lo and behold, it enriches this side of the room rather than that side of the room, and that's because I didn't know what I was doing. If only I'd understood how P worked, I would have pulled it back rather than pushing it forward. So, but that is...
That's implementation, not choice or
yes,
judgment.
the key thing is the distributional choice should be in the hands of politicians. But what I just try to illustrate is that whether it's decided by an elected politician or an elected technocrat, you need to know whether you need to push your lever or pull it, according to who's setting the approximate goal. Now, for that, you not only need somebody who claims to be an expert, you actually need a community of experts. This is one of the things I argue in my book, is I argue that
Commissions are better than
by
single
committees.
directors.
Yes. But imagine there are only 5 experts in the country. And so you appoint all 5 of them onto a commission. And they do something, and there's no one to
judge them, right?
to
Evaluate,
evaluate it. This goes back a bit to your question. Actually, to have transparency, you need this complicated system of translation services, where people sit up in Columbia, in the cutting edge of monetary economics. They do something kind of really way out there, and then that gets digested in ways that central banks can understand, and then they do it, and then people that write in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal explain it, and then people that write in the Washington Post and in my country, the Daily Mail, explain
Right,
it, and
it
then
goes down
people
to
read it,
the
and it
channels,
goes down like a translation. So it's Jeremy Warren has talks about a similar process in a different context. But in my thought experiment, where they are really 5 experts, but they're the only ones in your country, you've got a problem. You don't want to delegate because you've got to have sufficient expertise on the other side for public debate.
Well, your systemic risk council then have to create that kind of body of experts, right?
Yeah.
That can evaluate policy and critique
That's
it.
what civil society is, and people take it upon themselves to hold themselves out as being experts. That's why.
So you don't reject expertise, it's just,
No,
but you don't.
It's really important. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. But it's not a sufficient condition for quite an important reason, which is what I'm debating, which is you can harness expertise without having them make decisions. You can have them give public advice. So I think the Landis argument, I'm absolutely staggered that it was accepted over here for 7 years, which is so obviously wrong. By the way, it never had any traction in the...
But that was a New Deal, that was a New Deal model.
Never said we should delegate all these people because they're experts. Well, of course they're bloody experts. You can get them to advise the minister.
Right. That was the New Deal model we discussed over lunch.
It is astonishing. Right. It's absolutely...
And it kind of goes back to the Wilsonian model of even...
No, the Wilsonian model is terrible. So Wilson's papers, when he talks about the difference between politics and administration, Another way of thinking about my book is a whole set of dichotomies. Politics administration is one where I say
You're trying to rebut that. yeah.
ends and means.
Right.
For those of you that are interested in this kind of thing, there's a kind of Dewey-esque element to my book. I mean, part of what goes on in public policy isn't just that, oh, we know what the end is. What are the means? That's true for security, not being invaded and stuff like that. But for much of government, we're debating what the ends should be, and we're discovering what the ends should be as we pursue the means. It's kind of slightly simultaneous, recursive.
Right. Iterative learning.
exercise.
Yeah, right.
Well, that was a stupid thing to want. And it wasn't just a stupid thing to want because we didn't obtain it. It was when we got it, we thought, oh, no, that's not what we meant. I mean, that's...
And I guess
the democracy's trial and error in that respect. This is particularly so of parliamentary democracy. It's actually true in the kind of democracy here as well. It's a very, very important feature of democracy is its trial and error element, that we can change our minds both about means and ends. So going back to your question, what independent agencies are really doing is thought of like that. It's a political decision to suspend trial and error democracy. Because it's saying, oh well, we're not going to have
repeated votes on it.
repeated votes on whether to have high inflation or low inflation or whatever. So we've decided on that, and we're going to put it in a box over there, and the box or the device happens to be called the Federal Reserve. And what's really going on, in a deeper sense, is we're suspending the normal trial and error feature of democracy, whereas most public policies are merely for the time being. I hope that'll be enough. That's a bit less true here because it's so hard to pass laws. But it's still true here. It's very true for parliamentary policy. Everything is declared as though it's going to be there for 1,000 years, but actually very few policies are pursued even for 3 or 4. And that's just as true here.
And I guess what you're saying is expertise has its value, but it also has its blinders, right? Maybe that's what we've learned from a number of these recent episodes, that every profession has its blinders, its limitations.
And an expert should not determine for you, the society, what the goals are. The goals should be
Broadly.
yeah, I mean, yes. And that's what votes are about. What vision of society do we have? Democratic elections manifest themselves more in terms of ideological spectrum and vision. What's going on just under the lid is what goals do we want the government of the day to pursue for the time being? And we're faced as voters, we're faced with choices. Well, it's nothing to do with expertise. Expertise matters, in that if this side says, well, I really want to do X, you may have two kinds of arguments, which is one, I really don't want to do X, but my God, you think you can do X? No one can do X. And actually,
Not possible, right?
I mean, I'm not going to be specific, but in the UK at the moment, there are debates about certain authorities should do certain things that they're just not capable of doing. So there's that kind of disagreement. And there's also the disagreement, my God, we don't want that. That's different. But blood.
Well, please join, Rennie? Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a more experiential question. Judging from your time at the Bank of England and based on your recent scholarship now, what would you do differently from what you've done today, what you talked about?
Oh, gracious. Well, first of all, I'm so, well, actually, I think having regrets is good.
Yes. We learned from...
Yeah. So I regret not being able to play the piano. But not being able to play the piano is part of what it is to be me. And actually wishing I could play the piano is part of what it is to be me. That probably sounds like a strange thing to say. I didn't believe that the separation of banking supervision from central banking in the UK in the late 1990s would work. I thought it would look as though it worked in peacetime, and I thought it wouldn't work in a crisis. And I did what I could to try and bring my concerns to the attention of people. But there must have been more that I could have done. And should I have resigned when I didn't believe in the system?
Right.
So there you are. You rarely get honest.
So that was your shout from the
Questions of that
rooftops,
kind, and you just go.
shout from the rooftops moment, sort of, in a way, right?
I don't think it would have made any difference. I don't think I was senior enough then to make a difference. And even had I been, I don't think that would have made a difference. And I think it would be kind of deranged for me to think that it would have done. But that wasn't the question you asked.
Right.
The question you asked was, do I have that kind of feeling?
Well, please join me in thanking Paul.